All right, so let's extend this example by using inheritance. Inheritance allows us to take a class definition and extend it. We're going to create a new class that inherits all of the information from the other class and then add some new abilities to it, some new properties and or some new methods. So first, to do that, we just create another class definition. I'm going to call this superhero. We use colon to say a class inherits from another class. And we're going to say our superhero class inherits from our person class. Now, since we have defined a custom constructor here, we've defined our own class constructor, superhero has to call that constructor somewhere. So we're going to create an identical version of that. We're going to say public superhero. We're going to ask for first name and last name. But we're going to add this extra line here, a colon. We're going to say base, first name, last name. So this is kind of a confusing syntax and it's unique to C#, but this is what's happening. What we're saying is superhero is the same thing as a person. Everything that a person is, a superhero is also. But up here we said to create a person, you have to provide it with a first and last name. So we say when you create a superhero, you also provide it with a first and last name, and we give that information to our base class, the class we inherit from, in this case, person. So let's see an example of this. I'm going to add a little note here, creating a superhero so we can see what goes on. We're going to change X to be a superhero. So I'll put a breakpoint here so we can see what happens. So I'm going to create this new superhero. So when I create this and I step into it, I see that I'm going to go to this constructor, but the first thing that I'm going to do before I execute any of this code is to execute the base class constructor, which is my person. Okay, so when I execute this, it always does this first. This is called an inherited constructor or constructor chaining. So we're going to go up here, do all of this person code, and then we will come back to our superhero constructor and do anything additional that it wanted us to do. Okay? So X is still the exact same thing. It has all the same properties and methods and abilities as before, except now we've extended it to have the superhero definition. So since we have a superhero definition, we better do something about that. I'm going to create a new property within our superhero class that only superheroes get. So this will be I'll just call it power. And we can get and set that. And I'm going to add another variable up here, another parameter called power. And we'll say inside our constructor, this dot power is equal to whatever power we pass in. So now when we create our superhero, Bob Smith, Bob's power will be fly. Bob can fly. Now here's what's going to happen. We're going to create this superhero. We're going to pass in 3 parameters, first name, last name, and power. Before we do anything else, we're going to execute the base class constructor, which is going to jump up here and do all of this. Set first name and last name to those values, set age to its default. We'll then come back to the superhero definition and execute the code within that constructor, which in this case sets the power property to whatever power we pass in. Okay? Problem is we can't see any of that do anything interesting. And so we're going to take advantage of another aspect of inheritance, which is overriding a base class method. So our person class, we have the ability to say hello. And when the person says hello, they always say this line. What we want to do now is we want to have our superhero have a different greeting. And so what we can do is we can override the say hello method. And what we're saying here is since a superhero is a person, when we call say hello normally, it's going to call the person version of that method. But in our case, we want to override the say hello method. To do that, the compiler warns us that we have to mark it as either virtual, abstract, or override. So we're going to mark it as virtual. What virtual means is it says, hey, this method can be overridden or changed by our subclasses. So superhero is a subclass of person. We're going to override the say hello method. We can only do that if that method is marked as virtual. So now we can say a different version here. Hello, my secret identity is this.name, and I can this.power. So this will be our new greeting that superheroes only will say. When I execute this, we'll see that Bob Smith, our superhero, uses this new version, but Tom, who's still just a regular person, is going to use the old version. Now let's step through that to see exactly how that goes. So we're going to create our instance of our superhero. I'll just skip that because we know how constructors work. But when we get down here to say hello, I'm going to step into that method and we execute this version because it's a superhero. Y is the object instance for Tom, who is not a superhero. So we execute the regular say hello method. Also, notice down here, this is something I haven't pointed out. The X and Y objects show up in the debugger. They tell you what type of object it is. And if I expand these, it will tell you the values of their properties and internal variables. We can see all of that. Now, one thing that we can do that's very useful is we can create another method here inside of our main class. And since this is going to be called from main, we have to make this static. So I'm going to make this a static method, and it's going to say greet. This is the name of our method, greet person. I'm going to pass in a person who I'll just refer to as the person. And when I do, I want to call that person's say hello method. So now, instead of talking to these people directly, I'm going to call this method and pass in as an argument the person that I want to greet. Now, when I do this, notice that the exact same thing happens. We pass in X, who's a superhero. We call that say hello method for the person we passed in. And if we step through that, we'll see that process happen. We're going to call this method, step into it. The person is the same as my X person, which is Bob Smith, even though it's using a different variable name at the moment. We execute their say hello method. Then we call this method passing in Y. Now the person is Tom Jones, because that's who we passed in. We call Tom Jones's say hello method, which is just the normal one. Now, we made the parameter type person, and that allows us to pass in not only a person class, but any class that derives from a person class. Because another way to read this line is a superhero is a person. And so this method will take any person, a regular person or a superhero, because a superhero is a person. So this can be extremely useful when you're developing complicated programs and you've got different classes with derived types and you want all of them to go through the same processing steps, but internally they behave slightly differently. One more thing I want to show you is how to call a base class method. So we've talked about base a little bit here with our constructor that gets called automatically, but inside of any overridden method in the class, I can also do this. So I can say first, I want to call the base class's say hello method, and then I want to add in an extra bit of information here. Also, I can this.power. So now when I run this, Bob Smith's method, we'll go ahead and we'll put a breakpoint here so we can see what happens with Bob. So when I step into this, we're going to pass Bob in. We're going to call the say hello method. Since Bob is a superhero, we're going to call the superhero version. But the first thing the superhero version method does is says, call my base class version of say hello. In this case, that's the person method. So we're going to step into that. We'll execute the person version. Then we'll come back, finish executing the rest of the superhero version. And then we're done with that. And then when we do Tom Jones, we just do the person method because he's not a superhero. He's just a person. And so Tom Jones just prints out his name and age. All right. So that is a very high level overview of classes, properties, constructors, inheritance, overriding methods, calling a base class, etc., etc. Make sure you read through the book. It's got lots of more in-depth examples. If you have any questions, ask me on Slack or through email.